Hello, dear listener. This is the State of White Supremacy, May 3rd, 2020. This post is going to be primarily about things I've read over the past few weeks. Because I've been watching many films recently, and I try as little as possible to actually watch television unless there's something very specific that I feel that I have to watch or I might get some constructive information from. And you're going to get more useful information out of books, as most victims should know by now. Just like the past couple of weeks, I've been reading books on the golden age of black nationalism, and books that I recommended that book. Past couple of weeks, I read Black Nationalism in America, which was a book about twice as long as that, but it spans over a longer period of time, up to the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and all that. It didn't just end in the 1920s like the other black nationalism book. This book is made up primarily of speeches and editorials by black leaders. I prefer to read people's actual words rather than just the opinion of the author talking about the people. That's why Del Jones emphasized people's quotes in his Culture Bandits books when he was referencing black entertainers and the way black culture was being weaponized and used against us through these black entertainers. He made sure to reference things that the black entertainers actually said, rather so you would know that it's not just his opinion, things that they actually said to demonstrate how they'd been turned against their own people. I think that's important. That's why I prefer to read biographies written by the actual people that the biography's about. So, but that being that this book is made up so much of people's actual words, I really like that. And the book emphasized that in the history of this country, there have only been a few key points when black people have gravitated to nationalism, aka race solidarity, because in these books sort of define nationalism as promoting race solidarity or race pride. And that's after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which put all free black people in a position of being enslaved. That's pretty much what you saw in 12 Years a Slave. A free black person, like the Fugitive Slave Act created that circumstance where even the black leaders who were trying to end slavery were in a position to be enslaved once that law was passed, and that caused a spark of nationalism amongst the free black people. In the 1880s, after Reconstruction, there was a spike of black nationalism after the terrorism that ended Reconstruction. And in the 1920s, after the racial terror of summer of 1919 and the resurgence of the KKK, there was a resurgence of black nationalism, and of course Garvey was at the head of that. And of course in the 1960s with the Nation of Islam. In the 1880s, the idea of black people asking for a section of the country as a place for us alone was introduced. Like the whole idea of us immigrating kind of cooled off in the 1880s, and you had black leaders asking to have a section of the country, be just for us. Like that didn't start with the Nation of Islam in the 60s, how they were asking for land to be designated just for us. And back in the 1880s, there were black leaders that were asking the government for money to help establish this sort of separate nation within a nation. And Henry McNeil Turner was still, adamantly trying to get us to immigrate, and he asked for government money. He asked for like $100 million to help establish, black Americans in Africa, and they had a purpose they asked for that government money, but for an actual purpose, And that's why I asked today. I asked, what are the intentions of people who are asking for reparations today? Because they aren't asking for that money so they can actually, use that money to build something in Africa or something like that. That's why I asked, that they actually wanted the money and actually had a reason for it. We've been so socialized into consumption that I doubt it would be any different than that Chappelle show bit about reparations. About black people wasting all that money just buying garbage. But I'll get back to this. You know, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, of course, both contemplated removing black people from the country. And black leaders sought to immigrate prior to the Civil War as a solution to slavery, primarily, because those leaders, they had to combat, like the African Colonization Society, which a lot of leaders feared were trying to remove all the free black people from America to help maintain slavery, because they felt that they were just agitators and were, threatened the institution, and some of those leaders thought that they were trying to remove all the free black people, because I read a smaller book, Search for a Place, Black Separatism in Africa, 1860, which details the attempt of Martin Delany and Robert Campbell to colonize Africa, because they thought building a manufacturing base in Africa would make slavery obsolete. At that time, black leaders thought ending slavery was the end-all, be-all. It wasn't, for them, it wasn't about destroying white power. It was about just ending slavery was their primary concern. They thought ending that, and that would solve all of black people's problems. Ending white supremacy was beyond their thinking, really. And this obsession with a concept or an institution or an abstraction has continued to this day. We focus on slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, apartheid, prejudice, bias, discrimination, etc. We focus on all these abstractions and concepts and institutions to avoid dealing with the real problem, white people. We fight abstractions. This is why I don't pay any attention to anti-racists who just ramble at the mouth about concepts and abstractions, and they're just people that love to run their mouths and don't have any idea how to solve the problems. People love to just come across like they're experts on racism because they spout all these words and avoid dealing with the real problem. The problem is white people. I never heard anyone say that fascism was the problem in World War II, not the Nazis themselves. No, they said the Nazis were the problem, not fascism, not a concept. The people, those people, themselves were the problem. But when black people are involved, when white people are the perpetrators, concepts become the villain. Abstractions become the villain. Anything to get the focus off of white people themselves. Even though the white people are responsible for all of the concepts and institutions and things that I just spoke of. Segregation, Jim Crow, apartheid, slavery, all that. And yet they're responsible for all that, but somehow the topic always gets away from them. White people are the problem. And removing them from power would solve all of our problems. And this philosophy of obsessing over abstractions, is only helps them maintain their problem. And this philosophy of hoping they'll be nicer to us, and self-blame and admiration for whites, has been an essential part of black leadership in this country. I spoke a lot about that on my last post, talking about that other black nationalism book, about how so many of these leaders, so much of their speeches and rhetoric, there was so much self-blame and admiration for whites in their speeches. There were some leaders who spoke about African history and about our civilization in the past being superior to Europeans and how they came out of caves and Africans, contributed so much to human history in the past, and they would say this to even like a crowd of even white people there, and they would say this, and this is like back in the 1830s and 40s, and you had black people actually saying some of that stuff back then. But after that, like at some point, they would switch over and try to make it seem like ultimately their goal was not to separate African people from white people. The goal was for the races to be together ultimately. The goal was, and any sort of the degrading conditions that African people have been put in, it always switches over to blaming, especially after formal slavery ended, it became all about blaming black people for their conditions and telling black people that they needed to, tighten up and be more moral, and then maybe the lynchings would stop, maybe white people would like us, and even just that you even see recently that Van Jones on CNN recently blamed black people for dying at a higher rate to the coronavirus. That we needed to clean up our lifestyles like other races to fix the problem and stop abusing substances and exercise and all this sort of nonsense. And you don't see any other races today going on television and blaming themselves for dying. You don't see Chinese people going on television and blaming Chinese people for the coronavirus. We have to have a very particular psychology in the system of white supremacy. This is why I make it a point to call out the real villains, because so many of us, we've been doing this for so long. We've been doing this for so long, blaming ourselves, and that's the problem. And of course, this isn't the end point to ending white supremacy, but it is essential for black mental health. And you have no value to your race without mental health. It's like the ideology of contributionism, to gain the respect of whites is not a healthy philosophy. As much as I loved Carter G. Woodson and some other black people who sought to, reveal African history and thought that would bolster, pride in African people, but so many of those people, they didn't just do that just because they thought that it would make African people, reach their full potential. They thought that it was about telling white people that we contributed so much to human history, and therefore that white people would gain respect for us if they knew what we'd contributed to history, as if white people don't even know what African people have done. White people knew. White people know what African people have done, but that's going to promote the idea that white people are ignorant about history, and we just need to inform them, and then they'll treat us humanely once they know we've contributed to the history of the world. Like, white people know about the history, and they sought to destroy the history and make us not know about it. Studying our history is important, but it's the importance of studying our history is not to tell white people that we've contributed to human history. It's to give us examples of philosophies and economics and military planning and politics and the way you construct a society. Like W.B. Du Bois didn't just study African history, for contribution. He thought we could use that knowledge to imitate the successful African methods of the past. Like, we wouldn't be in such a bad shape as a people if we actually knew the history of African economics and how, because you don't build pyramids, for nothing. You have to pay people, you have to feed people, you have to have some sort of economic base to be able to do stuff like that. And if we knew history, we wouldn't be so poor. We wouldn't be able to be exploited by every other group if we actually knew African history in all regards. Studying history isn't just about beefing up your pride. You learn very practical things studying your own history. And lack of knowledge of our history is why we are ignorant of all these things. And we learn these things from Europeans, but they only teach it to us in a way that helps them. It's like claiming to want racial solidarity and claiming you want black people to have race pride while also wanting to assimilate with other races. It just reeks of poor mental health. And so many of leaders back then, race pride and race solidarity was just a prerequisite, a setup to let white people know what we're capable of as a race, in hopes that we would be able to ultimately just merge with white people. It was never about permanent separation from white people. How can you have race pride and want to commit race suicide at the same time? Sort of contradictions. And so many leaders made speeches about the superiority of black people regarding art and music and oratory and religious spirit, but attributed superiority of whites to all things regarding power, analyses, politics, military, And I always found that very annoying, the box that we put ourselves in, to this day, regarding to the benefit of white people. I find the stereotype of us being religious very annoying, considering I wasn't raised in a church. We're intuitive and whites are analytical. That nonsense really irritates me. We put ourselves in this box made for us and cannot think outside of it. To this day, we run to the churches. We are white people. They define what Africans are supposed to do, and to go against that is just totally beyond our thinking. This is why we see Africanness as primitive and seek to escape it. It's hard for us to see Africans as scientific, as owners of land and resources and military power. We don't see Africans as that. Even with the false pride of Black Panther involving technology from space, people, it's like we see ourselves. It is so bizarre. We cannot see the idea of it. So in movies, you never see Black people not being religious, Black people being scientific, and being African-centered and scientific at the same time. We always have to be emotional and religious, and back then the leaders were promoting the idea that that's what Black people were because white people told them that's how Black people were. And it's like, Amos Wilson always talked about that we need to gain the power of self-definition, that we define what Africans are rather than let other people define what Africans are. And become self-creating people, And the refusal, the fact that we see ourselves as emotional and unscientific is why we see separating from them as not an option. If we saw ourselves capable of self-sufficiency, we wouldn't hesitate to do things for ourselves. We didn't see ourselves as capable of self-sufficiency. We didn't see it 200 years ago, and we don't see it today. We think white people have to take care of us, that we can't take care of ourselves. And we truly, as a race, believe that. The world over, that we can't take care of ourselves because we put ourselves in this box. Despite the fact that we, at every level of the society, you can find Black people involved in scientific research, whatever, but they're doing research to benefit white people, not for African people. And yet we think that we can't take care of ourselves. It's ridiculous. But the main point of this book, to me, was made at the very beginning with a quote from Gunnar Myrdal. And the basic comment was basically saying that Black people ideologically sway towards whatever direction white people push us towards in the history of this country. When white liberals get their hands on us, then we become integrationists. And when white terrorists, abuse us overtly, then we become nationalists and separatists. And basically, we don't really have a real ideology. We just swing whatever direction white people, push us towards. That we're just children that just react to whatever white people do. This is why so many Black people used to be revolutionaries and then became conformists, neoconservatives, or white liberal puppets. In the 60s, they were revolutionaries and Black Panther Party, members and all that kind of stuff. And Black Power this, and then 20 years later, they're neoconservatives or white liberal puppets and not revolutionaries anymore. That they just flip-flop because they're just driven by emotions rather than a real ideology. Now, if we understood white supremacy, it wouldn't matter what white people did. White people's behavior wouldn't have any bearing on what we think. Because I don't care if a white person is smiling, or I don't care if they're snarling. My feelings toward them is the same way. Because I've reached conclusions about white people and white supremacy. If you know the nature and objective of the white race, then the ideology of Black nationalism and separatism doesn't change. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing made it clear to me the ultimate goal of whites, so there's nothing to debate in my mind regarding what white people want to do or what they're dedicated to. And I want to make it clear again, like when I read the last book, I'm not attacking the victims of the past, because I feel very close to them when I read, and I try to get into the headspace of of Africans of that period who were listening to them speak and try to, because I feel very close to them. I love them. And I'm sure their hearts were in the right place for the most part, and they thought they were helping their people and doing the right thing. But people can have good intentions and still lead you straight to hell. It's not enough to have good intentions. It's important to acknowledge failing methods. Even in people you love, you have to acknowledge. The refusal to acknowledge it is why people still, talk about the civil rights movement like it was a success. And anytime somebody gets shot by the police, we repeat the same failing methods in dealing with it. I mean, the fact that the NAACP still exists today epitomizes that commitment to failing methods. It's like W.B. Du Bois fell out with the NAACP during the Depression in the 30s because they had no economic ideas on how to help the black population. He saw what was happening. He saw the segregation. He saw the economic deprivation, and the NAACP didn't have any plans because they're just a protest organization, and he fell out with them. Because they were just a reactionary, protest, assimilationist organization that never solves any problems. And they still are today. That's why I say, read what the ancestors said and make sense. And what they said that makes sense, lock it away in your consciousness, integrate it into your personality, and disregard the misguided thoughts to create a more refined black nationalist ideology. I do recommend this book, but keep in mind that the book, it has 3 editors on it. John Bracy Jr., August Meyer, and Elliot Rudwick, and 2 of the editors are white. And I don't know why a book about black nationalism in America has 2 white editors, but this is why, don't talk to me about white people being ignorant about racism, because they are involved with more books about racism and books about history than anybody else. So don't talk to me about them being ignorant about it. But I do recommend the book. The next book I read was Empire of Guns by Priya Satya. A book primarily about the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire's expansion and its ties to weapons manufacturing. And it details how society, politics, economics can't be disconnected from a country's dependence on weapons manufacturing, and how manufacturers had to defend themselves against accusations of war profiteering, and how the culture was so dependent on weapons manufacturing to the extent that there was no segment of the society that could claim not to be involved. And how it managed guns and dealings with Africans and Native Americans and people in India, as well as all of their wars with other Europeans. The book shows how over time the primary use of guns sort of changed in the society. And like how originally guns sometimes were used as currency, and sometimes they just represented social status, or were sometimes used as just sort of deterrence because of the power of the gun seemed like magic to people in the beginning. So to the extent to where once they saw it fire once, you didn't have to use it anymore. And guns were not used to solve personal squabbles between people in the streets, personal sort of disputes. I'm sure this probably had a lot to do with the fact that it took longer to actually load guns back then. That you couldn't just pull it out and push a button in a very sort of impulsive way. The author argues that the cultural meaning of guns changed sort of over time in terms of what they represented. It would be easy to see the book as a diatribe about gun control, but it's not really. The author references Sandy Hook at the beginning in her own family history with guns, but just tries to link the culture's dependency on weapons manufacturing and the culture's psychology towards those weapons. It's like the author sees a connection, a link between mass shootings of today and the war on terror. And reading this book, again, like everything you read, I just look at this book from an African point of view, from African worldview, and so much of the book that the British saw perpetual war as essential to technological development and economic development. There was a lot of talk regarding economics and technological development and in connection to war, perpetual war. And this is why to this day you see the devotion of whites to investing in quote-unquote national defense, showing that philosophy has not changed. Their minority status in the world is made most apparent by their need to it is important that they always have an overwhelming military presence. Stockpiling is, enough weapons to kill every single human being on the planet 100 times over is essential because of their minority status, that they have to have an overwhelming military presence. And that's why every advancement they make in technology involves the ability to kill people in more efficient ways. And this is why, in reading this book after the previous book, it just brought me back to so many of those speeches by those black leaders calling Europeans civilized. And and it's so bizarre to think of, how can you think of people who think of war as being an essential aspect of human existence as civilized? People who devote their lives to instruments of death. People who promote the idea, because Europeans, because it's beneficial to them, they love to promote the idea that human beings are naturally violent and warlike. Because they are, Like I said before, albino mutants must reverse reality to make themselves appear normal. So they have to promote the idea that human beings are naturally what they are. They produce violent entertainment and claim it to be therapeutic, and claim that it prevents people from actually going out and actually being violent. Which is a bizarre sort of logic. I grew up, watching 1980s. I grew up on Schwarzenegger and Stallone, and grew up watching horror movies like the Friday the 13th movies that expected you to enjoy seeing people killed in violent ways. Realistic looking violence has always been an important part of white people's entertainment. This is why they had, for them, recreation was going down to the Coliseum to seeing people killing each other for recreation. And this thinking has no basis in the African history of thought. But if you've been taught to see the world through European eyes, then you buy into their logic. And that's the problem. So many of us allow our children to be taught to see the world through European eyes and see themselves as naturally wretched and violent and destructive, because that's how Europeans promote themselves as. And then we seek to be one of them. We embrace this logic because you want to be one of them. Just like we accept their logic about sexual confusion, we accept their logic about humans being naturally barbaric. And there's no way you can admire savages and not become one. It's like the Purge movies are all about this, about the idea that human beings are just naturally violent. And I'm not one of those people that claims that violent entertainment creates violence in the society. Movies, music, and video games don't make someone a killer. Entertainment reflects a culture's values. It doesn't turn people into killers, but it does reflect the values of a culture. And all your entertainment is filled with violence and destruction and mayhem. That does reflect. And a country is always at war with other countries. It's kind of obvious. Europeans value death. Their culture is a death culture. And wherever they go, they make more death. Even if they come there under the guise of helping people, more death arrives with them. And the importance of manufacturing was a big part of this book as well. The British knew the importance of manufacturing, controlling the means of production. Although they sold weapons to others, they made sure that their weapons were made in their country. They didn't want Africans and Indians and Native Americans to be making weapons. They didn't even want them to know how the weapons were made. And that continues to this day. The nations that suffer the most in this world consume and don't produce products for themselves. The resources go out and nothing comes in. That's African people on the continent and in America. Europeans drove, all of their victims into underdevelopment as a means to expand their global empire all over the world. We've been socialized into consumption. We only get fulfillment from consuming products. I mean, like a couple of weeks ago, a woman talked to me about the ridiculousness of hair care places still being open where we live, and why would people be going to hair care places buying products when all the clubs are closed? Like, what are you getting all dolled up for during a pandemic? You know, like people have just been socialized into consumption. It's always got to buy stuff, and mostly worthless stuff that doesn't mean anything. Like, this is why during riots always turn into looting. You know, this is a product of people being socialized. Like, the events are sparked by politics, but through emotion they lapse into just consumption. It becomes and just wanting to grab any garbage you can find to take home, and into a sense of fulfillment in just consuming products. You know, but we must buy stuff from other groups. We're socializing in consumption, but not consumption amongst each other. We have to buy stuff from outside of the race. Is where that fulfillment comes from. You know, and this is the product of being stripped of a culture and being made to produce for another race. You know, we've been externalized. We always gravitate towards producing for white people. Again, that's why I asked, what are people who want reparations planning to do with it exactly? Like, you don't want to separate from white people, so what are you going to do with reparations? That's going to say most likely you're just going to give the money right back to the white people. Like, the civil rights movement was successful for whites because it involved us abandoning institutions, disinvesting in our communities, and taking all of our money and resources to them. It gave them greater access to our money. That's why they promoted integration, you know, and causing us to break down, to abandon our businesses. Then we go over to them, and then they slam the doors in our faces and leave us out in the cold. And we've been out in the cold ever since. You know, so many black people back then saw freedom as the right to give white people all of our money. That's why so many of those protests were around, you know, retail stores and lunch counters, and being denied the right to give white people your money, you know, which is ridiculous logic, you know. And of course, you don't see any Democrats or Republicans talking about, when they talk about black people, you don't hear anything in them talking about black people owning land or controlling means of production or manufacturing our own products. All they talk about is jobs, because the assumption is that we want jobs from white people so that we can buy things from white people. You know, that's the assumption. No, none of them want us to be truly independent. They want us to consume and be in debt. That's what they want. That's what we're here for. Power is in ownership of land and resources and manufacturing your own products. You know. And that Michael Moore documentary, that Bowling for Columbine, came up to mind to me reading this book, because that documentary asked the question of what is the basis for gun violence in America, you know, and he dismisses the idea that America's history, violent history, is the reason why the country is so violent, claiming that other countries have violence in their history and don't have as much gun violence today. But that sort of suggests that of course, every country has some violence in its history, but you know, these other countries don't have as long. It's not, the violence is not the foundation of their country's history. You know, no other country has as long a history of perpetual war on its own soil as America does, because America is always at war with other countries, but the people who run this country are always at war with the population itself. Always have been, and to this day. And America is a land possessed by the criminals that stole it in the first place. It's run by criminals, you know, and that criminal psychology just filters down from the people that run it down to the population. You know, America is nothing but a graveyard, and American whites are prideful ghouls running the graveyard. And they continue to this day to justify their crimes, which creates a violent national character. They justify it all. They justify genocide. They justify slavery to this day. Every time they criminalize black people, they're justifying the enslavement of African people in the past and the continued enslavement of African people. You know, in that documentary, he tried to link America's foreign policy with the Columbine shooting. You know, like asking the question, like how can you people manufacture weapons, assassinate world leaders, fund terrorists, create wars all over the world, and you think your kids are not going to pick up on that and know what you're doing? And pick up on that violent character that you're promoting? You know, like Malcolm X was more right than he realized with his chickens coming home to roost comment about JFK's assassination. Because he didn't know. Like in that Surprise Kill Vanish book about how JFK was so in favor of assassinating people as a means of dealing with other world leaders, and then he's assassinated. Like Malcolm X was more right than he realized about the chickens coming home to roost. You think you can be responsible for all this violence all over the world and it's not going to come back to bite you? You know, 9/11 was the same thing. That whites are so arrogant that they can they can be responsible for so much violence all over the world and it's not going to come back to hurt them at some point. And then they play innocent. You know, responsible for so much death, and then they get hit once and act like they're the greatest victims the world has ever known. You know, of course, white supremacists promote the idea that gun violence in America is exclusively a black problem. You know, they really like to do that after especially after a white mass murderer goes off, because whites know. You know, like the coronavirus and every other destructive ailment in the society, you know, black people are going to be affected at a disproportionate rate. That's by design. Everything in society, anything negative, black people are always affected. And we have a particular psychology that's been interjected into our minds to create gun violence that is not going to be spoken of honestly by whites because it is functional in the society. That's why I recently purchased Amos Wilson's book, Black on Black Violence. You know, because for a long time I'd been meaning to purchase his book, listen to his lectures, but I actually bought a new pristine copy of it. Because he actually speaks about it not from the perspective that white supremacists do, but how violence between black people is functional to the society, to the benefit that the black people who engage in this behavior are doing it in service to white supremacists. You know, because in my mind, if black people were naturally as violent as white people, we would make our own guns. But we don't. White people have to supply us with guns to kill. Nowhere in the world do black people independently make weapons. Not in Africa, not in America. Black people don't make guns anywhere because white people wouldn't allow us to. You know? And that's the rules under white supremacy. We can't own land, and we can't manufacture products for our benefit. So again, our behavior is a product of being externalized. We're not driven by a sense of culture and history. We exist to serve aliens. You know. And looking at a book like Empire of Guns through African eyes, that's all you see. It's about how white people, and you know, I'm not against guns, you know, I'm against white supremacy. You know, and in the system that the Europeans have created, guns are an essential aspect of it. They are necessary. It doesn't mean you have to love them. You know, like people who love guns are crazy. But there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that they are necessary in the world as it's currently constructed. White supremacists worship weapons and see them as essential to civilization. You know, so you know, if you're an African and see Europeans as civilized, and you see the historical mass murder of African people as a civilizing process, you know, if you believe that, then you've made friends with death. And if there is a hell, it's waiting for you. You know, that's all I have to say on that. But I do recommend the book, though. I also read the book American Prison by Shane Bauer on his reporting as an undercover, as a reporter working undercover as a prison guard at a private prison in Louisiana. And that book is, you know, another book full of a lot of, you know, very, you know, interesting passages and conversations between prison personnel and the prisoners. You know, very, very disturbing, you know, stuff. The kind of stuff not a read for someone sensitive person you will throw the book away. You wouldn't even want to finish reading it after some of those passages. It's a sort of intercutting his reporting with the history of American prisons, so it goes back and forth, the structure of the book, and it's a searing indictment of the profit motive of private prisons in this society. Its closest relation is to Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. That book is even referenced in this book, and I would even say that a medical apartheid came to mind reading this book as well, because there's a lot of medical, related stuff in this book about, leased convicts dying and being sold to medical schools as cadavers, or black convicts being experimented on, or even with the reporter in this book talking about, and more recently, a black convict being neglected to the extent of having to have limbs amputated. About he was in a wheelchair and he saw this guy who had like no feet and fingers missing on his hand, all because the prison guards just disregarded him while he had gangrene on his hands and feet and had to have them amputated. It crosses many, and law enforcement and the mentality of the prison guards and law enforcement. It crosses many fields of reading a book like this, and the author was a former prison inmate, and acknowledges even the past history of whites taking them in these prison camps and taking the most violent prisoner and making them the prison guard, and if a prisoner demonstrated that they were willing to kill another prisoner trying to escape, then that person could be pardoned from the prison, and it kind of may remind you of the slave plantations, of making black overseers on the plantation, or rewarding black people for squealing on other slaves, and like capos in Nazi concentration camps, Jews being made the guards in the concentration camps. It's a long tactic white supremacists have used, of taking one of the victims and using them against the other victims. And a lot of the exchanges in the book reminded me of the crazy exchanges in war books like Dispatches. If you put people in inhuman conditions for a prolonged period of time, they're going to lose their minds. The difference is that inhuman conditions for us are there even when we're not in prison. That's the thing. That's why that's why it's more accurate to call prisons greater confinement for black people. That's why so many of us act like prisoners before we even get to prison. Our behavior, we think of our neighborhoods as our territories, like prisoners think of their prison blocks as their territories. That psychology begins with us at a very early age, of that prisoner sort of mentality, because being in the system of white supremacy is being in prison, And looking at this book, like a white supremacist would read this book and just, because they like to promote the idea that people in prisons have some sort of innately criminal personality and different from the rest of the population, and that's why they're in prison. And that's his logic, is saying that all soldiers in war have some sort of criminal personality that causes them to go crazy. There's no logic to that at all. There are people in prison that deserve to be there, but there are a lot of people who are not in prison that deserve to be there. White supremacist logic suggests that only the most disenfranchised element of the population commit crimes, and that is what fills the prisons. That only poor people commit crimes, and rich people don't commit crimes. That's the logic of the whites, because the prison is just filled with poor people, and of course those people are disproportionately black, And the exchanges between the prison guards, in this book, it sort of epitomizes American law enforcement. How you having these people with no credentials and no qualifications being given jobs that allow them to brutalize people and feel superior to people, in subhuman conditions. My job, I review legal documents involving the Chicago police every day. So every day I'm exposed to racist cop culture. I see the comments they make. Every report you see is you see nothing but black faces and cops doing this and cops saying that and cops doing this. one after the other all day long. So I'm exposed to racist cop culture, and this is after I'd already reached conclusions about law enforcement in this country. Anybody can become a cop, just like anyone can become a prison guard. You don't need any credentials or anything. And yet white supremacists treat cops like soldiers of the highest integrity who should always get the benefit of the doubt for no reason. You know, like in this book, you talk about the prison guard. He became a prison guard, and he was getting paid $9 an hour. And he said there were some people who've been on the job, who've been working there for years, and were still getting paid $9 an hour. About how the prison was so understaffed. There were so few people working there, and they were so poor. The facilities were so poorly equipped, and about how they didn't even have guns. You know, all they had was they didn't have any equipment to handle any situation. And the surveillance equipment barely worked. You know, making it clear that public safety was not the priority. It was about maximizing profits. You know, because I've worked for companies where the facilities are just so poorly kept, and the employees are so poorly low paid, with no pay raises, even potential, all for the sake of the people running the company making as much money as possible, producing products for as little as money as possible, so they can make as much money as possible. You know? Prisons in this country have never been about rehabilitating people. It's always been about making profits and creating instability in the black population and soothing the white psyche, and degrading black people is an essential aspect of that. It makes them feel better about themselves to see black people in degrading positions, you know. It's about making profits and degrading people. And it's just like cops who, at a disproportionate rate, extort money from black people through fines and warrants and tickets. And if you can't pay, then you go to jail. You know, and explain to me how two people can commit the same crime, but if one has a lot of money and the other does not, the one with the money can get out on bail while the other has to stay in prison, in jail. And they committed the same crime. That shows me that it's not about the crime itself was not important. It's about money. And jails are full with people with can't afford bail, can't afford anything, can't afford a lawyer. And that's why economic inequality is so important to the people who promote the criminalizing the whole population. They want a whole population of people who can't defend themselves, and that's why the prison society is so filled with people who can't defend themselves at all. You know, the prison population in this society really exploded at the very same time that black families, you know, that single-parent households became the majority around the exact same time that the prison population exploded in this society in the early 80s is when it flipped over and single-parent households became the majority. Now, of course, white supremacists also try to promote that, and the single-parent household is more of a product. It's economically a factor. And that if you go through class categories, you know, single-parent households is dominant amongst the poorest element of the black population. But the higher you go up class, you know, as far as income, it's not dominant. And so Europeans try to make it seem like, you know, single-parent households had nothing to do with economics. All of a sudden in the 1980s, you know, black men all of a sudden didn't want to be fathers in the 80s all of a sudden. There's no logic to it, but this is the logic that white supremacists promote. The prison system serves so many functions to maintain white supremacy in America. You know. And I didn't go into this book looking for talk about white supremacy, but you can't talk about any institution in society and not have white supremacy come up. And that's pretty much all the book was about. Especially prison. You can't talk about prisons in this society without white supremacy coming up. And the logic that whites expect you to believe that a nation built with slave labor can have the largest prison population in the world, making lots of profit from it, and there's no connection. And they would say that with a straight face. You know, that's the logic white people promote. It's like, I mean, like the New Jim Crow was probably the first book that I ever read that broached the prison system, the topic of the prison system, back when I first started reading books about racism. But that book was more about incarceration rate and how it creates this class of people with no rights, and about how you have people, so many people who can't vote or can't get decent jobs because they've been arrested and been totally disenfranchised, and how that maintains the destruction of society, you know. Whereas this book isn't about that. This book is more about the culture of private prisons, you know, and through lots of comments from, like comments from the past, after, the re-enslavement of Africans after the Civil War, comments from whites rationalizing the re-enslavement of black people in the convict leasing system, and, kind of comments that make most of us, that so many of us go to great lengths to avoid hearing or reading comments like this. We do in our lives, we just want to feel good all the time and hide from reality. I want to read what people actually said. I want to know what is in people's hearts. That's why I say I read nonfiction. I don't read fiction. Whites went from claiming slavery was a civilizing process to it protecting whites from naturally criminal black people. Then they jumped to religious rationales, to biological rationales, to physiological rationales. But the criminal nature ideology, to this day, is the one that's most openly accepted, especially about American politics. That's the one that's, to this day, that they don't use biological and physiological rationale openly, but the criminal nature. Anytime you see white politicians on television talking about crime being a problem, you know who they're talking about. And that's the one that's most openly acceptable today. And the book even, gets into the topic of prison rape. Is prison referenced in the book. The perverse sexual dynamic created by warehousing men without even the illusion of humane treatment or constructive use of their time. The rape dynamic between prisoners, as well as the rape dynamic between prison guards and prisoners, are spoken of. And just like in this society, victim blaming is only okay when you're talking about black people. Rape jokes are only funny when you're talking about men in prison. You can make rape jokes as long as you're talking about men in prison. That's so acceptable in American culture. Sort of dismissive attitude regarding prisons and just accepting them as a way of life. It's disgusting. So this book is full of just appalling passages. But to understand the function of law enforcement in the prison system, you have to understand how white supremacy works. And I highly recommend this book because it actually has things people actually said. It's like, if you want just as much as breaking rank, understand law enforcement, hear things that people actually really said, how the psychology that must exist between these people who occupy these positions and the motives that they have to maintain them. So I do recommend this book, definitely. Also, this week I attempted to read a book that I recently purchased called Black Resistance in High School, Forging a Separatist Culture by Patrick Solomon. I attempted to read it. I bought it in bulk with a few other books. I usually purchase used books in bulk, used cheap books. That's usually my process. Usually one of my method for purchasing books. I don't usually spend a lot of money on books. And I bought this book thinking that I knew what the book was actually about by the title. And then I thought it was actually going to critique the European educational system, and I was wrong. And how the book actually condemns black children for their failures in the European educational system. The author approaches the topic from the perspective that there's nothing wrong with the curriculum itself. And I stopped reading the book. I stopped, and I almost threw the book out because I was so irritated by what I read. But then I stopped myself and said, you know what? I didn't know what I was walking into. Now I should read the book. It's one thing to read a book not knowing what you're walking into, but now that you know you're reading a book written by one of the bad guys, then you can go in and you can get some. You can actually gain some. You can gain something from reading it, knowing that it's read by one of the bad guys. So many of us walk into these situations thinking we're getting constructive information and have faith in the person giving us information, and they're giving us the wrong information, and we're made dumber by it. That's why I say it's not important just to read. You must approach your reading from an African-centered worldview. If I read this book 10 years ago, I would have been made dumber by reading it. I imagine a black child walking into this would be made dumber and self-blaming by reading it. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been searching for books about apartheid South Africa that don't promote the lie that apartheid ended, and I can't find any. Just like I can't find any books that detail how the civil rights movement was a total failure to black people and a success to whites. I can't find them. Like if you know of any books about apartheid South Africa that actually has some truth to it, please let me know. Anyone listening to this, if you know of any you can recommend, please let me know that actually has some truth to it. For the longest time, Dr. Claude Anderson and Dr. Amos Wilson were the first people that I ever heard criticize the civil rights movement for its failures, for its economic failures, for its psychological, misguided approach to fighting white supremacy. And black children are made dumber every day by their parents when they are told that the civil rights movement was a success and that they live in a new day. And this is why black children, are twisted, by whites into the logic and become so confused about even their own gender in an effort to be down with white people. When they think they live in a new day, they've passed through this, this rough period, and now they're living in a new day with their white brothers and sisters, and if they go against what white people want them to do, then they're regressing, So therefore, they embrace whatever twisted logic that white people promote, and we let them. The educational system, like every other institution in society, is designed to maintain the status quo. And the status quo in this society is massive, massive inequality and the degradation of African people. Massive. The only education black children get from Europeans is one that teaches them to be servants. An education that excludes them from history and gives them no sense of who they are or where they came from. An education that causes you to see the world through European eyes. An education that causes you to see the world in terms pro-European and anti-everything else. And black children who go to these schools aren't even aware of it consciously, most of the time. But they can sense that they're getting a worthless education. And their resistance in some respects has logic to it. Except they don't have an alternative because their black parents don't provide them with an alternative. They reject this European education system because they know it's useless, but they don't have anything to fall back on, so they end up in the streets, falling into juvenile delinquency because they don't have any alternative. It's a shame that the parents send them to these schools in the first place. We seem to just see public school. We're in such desperate situations as the people, economically and everything, that we just see public school as a way to get rid of our kids while we're at work. We just want to get the kids out of our hair so we can go to work, and it doesn't matter what they're being taught. And I don't blame the children for this. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that we have more college degrees today than we did in past decades, and yet there are fewer black businesses. What does that tell you? That tells you that these degrees are not designed for us to be in control of anything. These degrees are designed to keep us servants. The European education gives you information in the wrong context, in a context that makes you dumber. I mean, so this is how you get people like Ben Carson and Clarence Thomas and Colin Powell and Barack Obama. That's how you get people like that. No African worldview to be seen amongst any of them. Only eagerness to serve whites and maintaining what they have. College degrees under white supremacy might as well be toilet paper to black people. Like my stepfather the other day talked about how his sister has a bachelor's degree and can't find a job that pays more than $12 an hour. The degree is worthless. I really wish I hadn't gone to college and put myself into such tremendous debt. Because my college education hasn't factored into any job that I've gotten since. Worthless. So I would never encourage a black child to go to college. I've learned more useful information just reading books written by self-respecting Africans than I ever learned in schools. And I mentioned earlier how I bought Dr. Amos Wilson's Black on Black Violence book. I also bought Blueprint for Black Power and the newer book, The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat. And I didn't just buy them. I made sure, because I usually buy used, cheap copies, I made sure to buy brand new, pristine copies of each book because it's Amos Wilson. I have to. And I just bit the bullet and I said, I usually don't spend a lot of money on books. I usually don't spend more than $10 on books. But with his books, I mean, in these books, like Blueprint for Black Power, you can't find that book online for less than $35, $40. And I said, you know what? It's Amos Wilson. It's ridiculous that I should have more of his books in my possession. And I ended up just buying all of them, spending $40, $50 on a book, and I just didn't care because it's Amos Wilson. And I will treasure those books always. And it's just so disturbing that we don't care enough to educate our own children and allow them to be educated to be used against us. This is as much race suicide as sexual play with whites and shooting each other in the streets. I don't see black parents who send their children to be educated by white people any different from black people who shoot each other in the streets. This is suicide as much, and it needs to stop. Be careful what you read, people. As I say, the perspective of the writer. Don't just read. Be very careful what you're reading, because most of the reading the Europeans have out there, most of the books they write, white supremacists write so many books demonizing African heroes, promoting failures as successes, and this is all a process of shaping our consciousness and making us see everything in a backwards fashion, So be very conscious of what you're reading, and everything you read, look at it through African eyes if you want to maintain any semblance of sanity. I also read Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexican Border by John Carlos Frey. The book details the militarization of the Mexican border over the past few decades in an effort to deter migrants from attempting to cross the border. How the U.S. causes so much more death, unnecessary deaths, in an effort to deter people from crossing the border, and how the attitude of border law enforcement has changed over time, and how border police shooting people used to be a rare thing and then has become very common now. The incredibly inhumane way the authorities deal with the corpses strewn all over the routes where the migrants traveled on from dead people, and disposing of the corpses and everything. The author acknowledges that Bill Clinton began the modern form of anti-immigrant sentiment in American politics towards the Mexican border. That it really started with him. That he began the deterrent method that put more Mexicans in the position to die en route to traveling to America. The author doesn't, display any sort of political bias. He acknowledges that the militarization of the border, of course, got worse after 9/11 under George W. And how under George W. Mexican migrants became pretty much were pretty much put in the same category as Muslim terrorists under the guise of national security. You know, that they're all transferring drugs and they're all a threat to the fabric of the society. And then of course Obama deported more people than any president before him. And of course Trump's whole main appeal to his base was anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant sentiment. The book, it has a lot of the history of the Mexican border and how it's been policed, in detail. And the author devotes most of the book to how the U.S. uses the potential of death as a deterrent to Mexican migrants, rather than neutralize the climate that causes them to flee in the first place. Just going to put them in a position to die as a deterrent. And I want to make it clear, reading this, that I didn't read this book out of concern for Mexicans. Africans don't have friends amongst other races. I read this book from an African worldview. In doing so, I only saw the parallel with African migrants that die in the process of trying to get to Europe. The violence of the border police towards migrants greatly resemble American law enforcement towards the black population, especially the rise in shootings and the lack of people being held accountable for their actions. Greatly resembled that. And how, every black person is a criminal, just like every Mexican is a drug dealer. The migrants situation is so obvious, when you understand white supremacy. Europeans invade and steal land. They steal resources and drive races of people into underdevelopment, starvation, and death. Then they realize they can control the nations afar and install neo-colonial leadership to give the appearance of democracy while funding wars to keep those nations unstable. These conditions cause people from the nations to flee, and the only places they can flee to are the nations of whites that robbed their nations to begin with. This book only shows how refined whites are today to be able to get away with so much mass murder without being called mass murderers. At the border, they do a lot of it through deterrence. Killing hundreds, thousands of people, and nobody's calling them mass murderers. Just like their drones overseas, they've been bombing people from the sky for decades, killed thousands, millions of people. And nobody calls them mass murderers. But as long as they're in power, they'll always be able to make people blind to their criminality. They can kill, and you can't do anything. You can call them killers, but they have the might to just. What are you going to do about it? They kill, and their response is, "What are you going to do about it?" And the book made it clear the foolishness of supporting either political party. Just complete stupidity. Clinton began the militarization of the border and the anti-immigrant sentiment. It has some of his speeches that he made that could have been made by Donald Trump. In his effort to show conservatives how tough he was, while at the same time dramatically increasing the prison population with black people and all that kind of stuff. It's like that. How Mexican border race baiting, become a staple of American politics, and how so many politicians have had their political careers saved by race baiting about the Mexican border, before Trump, So that's why taking sides between Democrats and Republicans is one of the dumbest things a victim of racism can get into, Because I get amused looking at my YouTube page regarding what stuff gets a lot of likes or dislikes, or what gets comments and what doesn't. Because most of the stuff that I post, the stuff that gets the most likes are audiobooks, but even those get very few comments. I get very few comments. The Dispatches book is the one where I get the most comments from. But all the stuff that I post myself, I get very few views, no comments ever. Hardly any comments, hardly any likes or dislikes. I get dislikes. I'm sure I get a lot of dislikes, of course, from white supremacists themselves, but I'm sure I get dislikes as well from people who get annoyed that I don't take sides. Like if I went on and on about how great Democrats are, I'm sure I would get a lot of likes on my videos. Or if I went on and on about how great Donald Trump is, conservatives would give me a radio show. So I could make a fool of myself to have a wider forum to make a fool of myself. But because I don't take either side on my videos, I get fewer of either. That I hardly get any likes, any views, and get dislikes, I'm sure, because if I'm willing to say anything negative about Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, because so many of us just this robotic thinking that if you're not for one, you're for the other, and I'm for the truth. And it's absurd to say that either political party is on the side of black people. It's absurd. The goal of both sides is to maintain white supremacy. And I'm sure I get a lot of dislikes because I'm not a lapdog of either white supremacist party. One party is overt monsters while claiming not to be, and the other party pretends to be humane while being monsters behind the scenes. It's absurd. My stepfather, I love him, but he admits he doesn't read books, and yet tried to shame me for not voting and contributing to Donald Trump being elected. A man that doesn't read, and yet he thinks that voting is going to solve all our problems. Like, you say, oh, white people want to stop us from voting, so we need to vote. White people try to stop us from reading, too, and you don't read. Like that's the logic we operate from, thinking that the easiest thing is going to solve our problems. I said, he actually thinks it matters which white person is in office. If you look at the world from the African perspective, it don't matter which white man is in office. One isn't any better we're not going to be any better on either one of them. If Joe Biden was in office, it wouldn't feed everyone in Africa and stop drone strikes. It wouldn't lower the black infant mortality rate. It wouldn't raise the black life expectancy if he was in office. The only interesting aspect of Trump being removed from office would be he and his base's reaction to the election loss. That would be the most amusing aspect of it. Like, would his base actually start a war? Would Trump refuse to leave? That would be the only reason I would want to see. The main reason I would want to see removed from office would be just to see what the reaction would be. No, most people want Trump out of office because he's such an annoying, blowhard. He's so irritating. People want a less annoying person in the White House. He is irritating. He's excruciatingly irritating, excruciatingly obnoxious. But I don't think there's not a single person that's ever been president of the United States whose hand I would shake, who I see as a pillar of integrity and deserves my respect. They all direct murder all over the world. They're all killers. The moment you vote somebody into the White House, you make them a killer, because their job is to direct murder all over the planet. So it's absurd to say that you prefer one over the other. One is going to be more moral than the other one. They just want somebody in office who's less annoying. The problems of African people are not going to be solved by anybody in the White House. We have to solve our problems. But I do recommend this book to those who have no illusions about American politics and about how race baiting is a staple of it, regardless of political party. Lastly, this week I began to watch a few episodes of that Last Dance Chicago Bulls documentary series about the Bulls' last season. Their last season of the Bulls' 90s dynasty intercut with their rise, going from one person to the next and their sort of ascent through the 90s. And at the point I'm speaking now, I've seen 4 episodes, and it's supposed to be like 10. And strange because, I feel I'm so different from who I was. It was a sort of a nostalgic sort of time travel trip for me to watch the documentary, because I grew up a massive Michael Jordan fan when I was a kid. It's just strange watching the documentary series, because it made me feel old, because that documentary series, I'm sure, is made primarily for younger people who perhaps grew up and never saw Michael Jordan play, and definitely didn't see Michael Jordan play with the Bulls, you know, when they were winning their championships and everything. And, I remember that stuff vividly. Like, that's a big part of my early childhood is watching the Bulls win those championships. So that made me feel a bit old. And I felt that I hesitated to watch them before because, like I said, like that's a very distant part of my past that I feel disconnected from. And I felt that in the past I'd already seen so many documentaries. I saw the games being played. I saw the documentaries that came out back then. So I knew everything there was to know about the Bulls of that period. Of course, this documentary series, it has some additional new behind-the-scenes footage that I hadn't seen before. And I tried to find some constructive thing to take out of watching the documentary. And, of course, it would be easy, like so many of us like to do now, to rail against Michael Jordan. Because so many victims now love to rail against, that mentality of, the people who love to throw around the word coons and Uncle Tom and sellouts and it's like I'll criticize, like previously in this post, I brought up, Ben Carson and Barack Obama and Colin Powell and Clarence Thomas and Van Jones's tacky comments blaming us for dying at a higher rate of the coronavirus. And I try as best I can. It's becoming increasingly difficult for me to fight that anti-blackness. The more information I get, it becomes harder for me. I'm sure it's a product of getting older too and getting more agitated. That it's harder for me to fight that off, to avoid name calling and railing and promoting a specific victim as being the source of all the problems. That like this is the good one and this is the bad one. That whole Malcolm and Martin thing. We always got to make one black person the good ones and one the bad one. My main reason I'm not going to rail against Michael Jordan right now is because there was nothing unique about Michael, what he represented to whites. He was just the most popular. He wasn't an anomaly. He was used to shame the rest of the black population for not being as successful as him. He was used to promote the idea that white supremacy was no factor in the lives of black people. He was used to sell products to produce profits for white people. Just like Michael Jackson, just like Bill Cosby, just like Oprah. Black people that were used to sell products, make white people richer. He was a massive weapon for whites in an effort to socialize us into consumerism. Till this day, black youth see his shoes as must-have. Getting us to see a black person as being cool and hip or whatever, then we'll buy any product that they promote. But that's no different. I don't see him any different than black athletes today, or any. They aren't any. They promote products just like he did. Some athletes might speak out suggesting they show concern for the plight of the black population. Like people want to praise LeBron James like he's, the most pro-black, African in the world, just because he's willing to say something, whereas Jordan didn't say anything. But that's all they do is speak, for the most part. They don't not solve any problem. You honestly think that LeBron James is willing to give up everything that he has for the rest of the black population? You think that he's, I refuse to believe that anyone who prospers in the system of white supremacy wants it to be toppled. Anybody who gets super rich in the system of white supremacy is not against it. It's hard for me to believe that's the case. And someone who gets rich producing profits for white people. It's one thing if we have an economy that's separate from white people and we're making each other rich. But if you're working for white people, selling products from white people and selling them to the victims, it's hard for me to believe that you want that system to be toppled. They promote products. The black athletes today promote products and make white people richer, just like Michael Jordan did. So watching this documentary series, other than nostalgia, I had to find some other reason to watch it. And looking back as a child, I admired Michael Jordan because he represented excellence in a particular field. My objective as a child, no matter what field I grew up to work in, I wanted to be the Michael Jordan of that field. Michael Jordan shows how incredible an African can be when they are completely 100% dedicated to something. Our problem is that we only devote a lot of time and energy to unimportant things. That's the problem. Sports is completely unimportant. I used to be heavily into all sports. I used to watch football, baseball, basketball. I used to watch pro wrestling. I used to watch all this stuff when I was boxing, all of it. And I don't watch any sports anymore. I grew out of all of it. I was sobered up. And I don't flip out over trivial, stupid things. I don't watch any sports at all. White people rule the world and concern themselves with domination, and we play ball games. We devote our time and energy and hearts and souls to games that ultimately make white people richer and more powerful. Imagine how powerful we would be as a people if we put all of our energy into the development of power. Imagine an army of Michael Jordans dedicated to building an empire. Put all of that African energy into that. How amazing it would be. Misdirecting our energy is essential to white supremacy. That's where violence against each other comes from, misdirected energy. That's where consumerism comes from. Our race needs an army of Michael Jordans that see white supremacy as the team that needs to be defeated. The race needs Africans that can work as a team against other races. That's what I take from watching the episodes of this Last Dance documentary. Is we need to see the world as a league and to see our race as a team, and take that African supremacy off of the basketball court and take it into the real world. Because if we took that level of devotion and energy we put into worthless, pointless activities and took it into the real world, we would rule the world easily. Looking at this documentary series from that through African eyes, that's what I take away from it, rather than railing against people who don't do what I want them to do. That is what I take away from it. And that's all I have to say, really, for right now. These difficult times, I hope other Africans have found a way to deal with it. I hope found ways to not have to be out and be safe and secure with your family. Take care of each other. I wish you all the best. Thanks for listening.
I've often said, and I say again and again, in order for us to be in the position we are in, we have to be out of our minds. We have to be crazy. And I mean that literally. The essence of black psychology today, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is a political necessity for black people to be out of their minds. This is where you have to start if you're going to deal with reality in terms of black people. We cannot be in our right minds. And I mean this literally. I'm not being rhetorical. We cannot be in our right minds and be in this position of servitude. You cannot do it.